The scorching Arizona sun beat down on Samuel Hayes as he rode his chestnut mare across the parched landscape. Dust clouds rose with each hoofbeat, coating his weathered denim and leather with a fine layer of earth. At 52, Samuel's face was a roadmap of hardship. Deep lines etched around piercing blue eyes that had witnessed the best and worst humanity had to offer during 3 decades as a U.S. Marshal. Those days were behind him now. His badge turned in after the incident in Tucson that left 3 men dead and his reputation in tatters. A reputation he'd spent 20 years building, destroyed in a single night of violence that the newspapers had spun into a tale of excessive force and questionable judgment. Samuel adjusted his worn Stetson, squinting at the horizon, where a small homestead appeared as a wavering mirage in the heat. "Easy, girl," he murmured to his horse as they approached a crude wooden sign reading, "Circle W Ranch." His letter of introduction from the cattle baron Theodore Wilson burned a hole in his pocket. The job offer had come as a surprise. Ranch foreman at a struggling operation in need of experienced leadership. The pay was modest, but fair, and more importantly, it offered distance from the whispers that followed him through the streets of Tucson. Samuel had telegraphed his acceptance immediately, packed his meager belongings, and headed north without looking back. What the telegram hadn't mentioned was that since Wilson's passing 6 months prior, the ranch had fallen under the control of his 3 daughters. Samuel frowned at this unexpected complication. In his experience, women running a cattle operation usually spelled disaster, especially in this unforgiving territory where respect was earned through strength and grit. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from today? The main house came into view, a substantial 2-story structure with a wide porch and solid log construction, speaking to Theodore Wilson's former prosperity. Several outbuildings, a large barn, and numerous corrals completed the picture of what had once been a thriving operation. Yet even from a distance, Samuel could see the signs of decline. Fences needed mending, the barn roof showed patches of hasty repair, and the cattle visible in the nearest pasture appeared fewer than the land could support. As he approached, a young stable hand emerged from the barn, eyeing him with suspicion before calling toward the house. Samuel dismounted slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his right leg, a souvenir from a Comanche arrow 15 years earlier that still troubled him in changing weather. The front door swung open, revealing a striking woman in her late 20s. She stood tall and confident, wearing practical riding clothes rather than the dresses Samuel might have expected. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense braid, and her expression was one of careful assessment as she descended the porch steps. "Mr. Hayes, I presume?" she called, her voice carrying across the yard with unexpected authority. "I'm Elizabeth Wilson. We received word of your arrival from town." Her handshake was firm, another surprise, and her green eyes held his gaze without wavering. "My sisters and I have been eagerly awaiting your arrival. Father's letter spoke highly of your reputation as a lawman." Samuel detected no irony in her words, only a businesslike efficiency that suggested she either didn't know about Tucson or had chosen to overlook it. "Ma'am," Samuel replied with a nod, removing his hat briefly as a gesture of respect he didn't entirely feel. "Your father's offer was timely. I'm looking forward to putting my experience to use here." He glanced around the ranch yard, already mentally cataloging the work needed. "Seems like you could use an extra hand." 2 more women emerged from the house, flanking Elizabeth on either side. Though all 3 shared the same striking green eyes, they were otherwise distinct. The youngest appeared barely 20, with golden hair and a wary expression, while the middle sister had dark hair and a calculating gaze that immediately put Samuel on edge. Elizabeth performed brief introductions. Catherine, the dark-haired one with a sharp mind for business, and Margaret, the youngest, with a natural way with horses, according to her sister. "You must be exhausted from your journey," Elizabeth continued. "James will take your horse to the stable. Please, come inside where it's cooler. We have much to discuss." Samuel hesitated only briefly before handing his mare's reins to the stable boy and following the Wilson sisters into the house. The interior was surprisingly well maintained compared to the external deterioration, with solid furniture and tasteful decorations speaking to better days. A house that had once seen prosperity and might again with proper management. Samuel remained standing, hat in hand, as Elizabeth gestured toward a chair at a large oak dining table where papers were already spread out. "Please, make yourself comfortable. Catherine has prepared the ledgers and ranch records for your review. We believe in transparency with our foreman." Samuel took a seat cautiously, noting the neat columns of figures that Catherine slid toward him. His brow furrowed as he skimmed the numbers. "These cattle counts seem low for an operation this size," he observed. Elizabeth's expression tightened slightly. "We've had problems with rustlers over the past year. Since Father's passing, certain elements have viewed the Circle W as vulnerable." The implication hung in the air between them. A ranch run by women was seen as easy pickings in this territory. Samuel nodded, understanding the situation better now. "The neighboring ranches?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice cool and precise. "Particularly the Bar None outfit. Their foreman, Jackson Caldwell, worked for our father years ago. There was bad blood between them." "Caldwell was dismissed for stealing," Margaret added, her youthful face hardening with anger. "Now he works for Richard Prescott, and their operation has mysteriously grown while ours diminishes." Samuel recognized the name. Richard Prescott had a reputation throughout the territory as an ambitious man who expanded his holdings through means both legal and otherwise. If he had set his sights on the Circle W, 3 women alone would have little chance of holding him off, regardless of their determination. "I see," Samuel said, his mind already turning over possibilities. "And the local law? The sheriff in these parts?" Elizabeth's bitter laugh told him everything before she even spoke. "Sheriff Miller dines regularly with Prescott. His deputy patrols our boundaries only after cattle have already disappeared." "That's why we needed someone with your particular background, Mr. Hayes," Catherine interjected, fixing him with an intense stare. "Someone who understands both ranching and law. Someone who can't be intimidated." Samuel's jaw tightened. They hadn't chosen him despite his notorious past. They'd chosen him because of it. They wanted a man with a reputation for violence, someone whose mere presence might give rustlers and land grabbers pause. "I'm a rancher now, not a lawman," he said carefully. "I can help restore this operation, improve security, train your hands properly, but I'm not looking for trouble." Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes flashing with determination. "Trouble has already found us, Mr. Hayes. We're simply preparing to meet it on more equal terms." Before Samuel could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an older Mexican woman, bearing a tray of coffee and cornbread. "Gracias, Maria," Elizabeth said with genuine warmth, before turning back to Samuel. "Let's continue this discussion over some refreshment. You've had a long journey, and we have much more to share about the situation here." Samuel accepted the steaming cup, noting that despite their apparent financial troubles, the china was fine quality, another remnant of Theodore Wilson's better days. As they discussed the immediate needs of the ranch, Samuel found himself reluctantly impressed by the sisters' knowledge. Elizabeth clearly understood cattle and range management. Catherine had a head for figures that would put most bankers to shame, and even young Margaret contributed insights about the horse stock that demonstrated genuine expertise. "Your sleeping quarters will be in the foreman's cabin," Elizabeth explained as they finished. "It's been vacant since our last foreman departed." She stopped abruptly, exchanging glances with her sisters. Samuel caught the look and set down his cup. "Left or was driven off?" he asked bluntly. Margaret answered, her youth showing in her directness. "Frank Miller was found dead 3 months ago, shot in the back while checking the north pasture." A heavy silence followed this revelation. Samuel had suspected something of the sort, but having it confirmed changed the stakes considerably. "You failed to mention that in your telegram," he observed dryly. Catherine's chin lifted defensively. "Would you have come if we had?" Samuel considered the question honestly. "Probably not," he admitted, "but starting with deception isn't how I prefer to do business." The sun was setting as Samuel settled into the foreman's cabin, a simple but solid structure about 100 yards from the main house. After inspecting the small building thoroughly, old habits died hard. He unpacked his few possessions, including the Colt Peacemaker that had accompanied him through 20 years of law work. He cleaned the revolver methodically, a ritual that helped clear his mind. The situation was more complicated than he'd anticipated. Taking on rustlers was one thing, but challenging a powerful man like Prescott was another matter entirely, particularly when the local law was in his pocket. As darkness fell, Samuel lit a lantern and spread out the ranch maps Elizabeth had provided, studying the boundaries and terrain features by the flickering light. The Circle W was substantial, or had been before Theodore Wilson's death, with good water access and prime grazing land. No wonder Prescott wanted it. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to his Colt before he called out, "Who's there?" Elizabeth's voice answered, "It's just me, Mr. Hayes. May I come in?" Samuel slipped the gun back into its holster, but kept it within reach as he opened the door. Elizabeth stood alone, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "I wanted to apologize for the deception," she said without preamble. "Catherine was right that you might not have come, but she was wrong to suggest withholding the truth." Samuel appreciated her directness. "Come in," he offered, stepping aside, "though it's not proper for you to be here alone." Elizabeth's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Propriety is a luxury we can't afford, Mr. Hayes, not with our survival at stake." She entered the cabin, glancing around at its sparse furnishings before taking the single chair he offered. Samuel leaned against the rough-hewn table, arms crossed. "Tell me what really happened to Frank Miller," he requested. Elizabeth sighed, suddenly looking tired beyond her years. "Frank was a good man, loyal to our father and then to us. He stood up to Prescott's foreman when cattle started disappearing, threatened to bring in federal marshals since the local law wouldn't help." Her hands twisted in her lap. 3 days later, one of our hands found him, shot in the back with his own gun missing. Samuel nodded grimly. It was an old story in the territories. Eliminate the opposition. Make it look like robbery or an accident. After that, most of our hands quit. Can't blame them. Few men are willing to die for a paycheck. "Yet you're asking me to take the same risk," Samuel observed, watching her carefully. Elizabeth met his gaze unflinchingly. "Yes, but with full knowledge of what you're facing, and with better compensation than Frank received." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded document. This is a contract. Catherine drew it up. It offers you 15% of the ranch's profits once we're operating in the black again. A partnership, not just employment. Samuel's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. Such an arrangement was unusual, to say the least. Your sisters agree to this? Elizabeth nodded firmly. It was Catherine's idea, actually. We need someone with a vested interest in the Circle W's success, not just a hired gun who can be bought off or scared away. Samuel took the document, but didn't immediately open it. Why me, Miss Wilson? There are other experienced ranch managers who don't carry my baggage. Elizabeth's gaze didn't waver, because in Tucson, when those men tried to rob the bank and took a child hostage, you did what was necessary to save her life. The newspapers called it excessive force. I call it moral clarity. Samuel stiffened, memories of that day flooding back. The terrified eyes of the 8-year-old girl, the bank robber's arm around her neck, the split-second decision that had left 3 men dead and his career in ruins. You've been making inquiries, he said, voice rough. Elizabeth nodded. Thoroughly. We needed to know exactly what kind of man we were bringing into our home. Dawn broke with a chorus of roosters and the bustling sounds of a ranch coming to life. Samuel had spent a restless night considering Elizabeth's offer, finally signing the contract just before first light. Partnership in a struggling ranch might be worth nothing, or it might be a fresh start if he could turn the operation around. After a quick breakfast in the cookhouse, where he sized up the remaining ranch hands, 8 men where there should have been 20, Samuel saddled his mare and prepared to ride the boundaries with Miguel Ortiz, the most experienced of the remaining cowboys. Miguel was in his 40s, with the quiet competence that Samuel respected and knowledge of the land, born from working the Circle W for over 15 years. The señoritas, they are good people, Miguel said as they rode toward the northern boundary. Don Theodore, he treated his workers fair. The daughters, they try to do the same. But keeping good help has been difficult since the trouble started, Samuel finished for him. Miguel nodded, his expression somber. Men have families. They cannot risk. He stopped abruptly, reining in his horse and pointing toward a break in the fence line ahead. Samuel immediately recognized the deliberate nature of the damage. Not weather or animal pressure, but intentional cutting of the wire in a pattern that would funnel cattle through the opening. How often does this happen? Samuel asked, dismounting to examine the cut wires more closely. 3 times each month, Miguel replied, always in different places, always when we have moved the hands to other areas. Samuel nodded grimly. Someone was watching the ranch operations, learning patterns, striking where vigilance was weakest. They'll be back, Samuel said, helping Miguel repair the fence. Tonight or tomorrow, once cattle have wandered through. Miguel nodded in agreement. We have not enough men to watch all boundaries. Samuel considered this as they worked. 8 men couldn't patrol the entire perimeter of a ranch this size, especially against determined rustlers who studied their movements. They needed a different approach. Tell me about the hands who left after Miller was killed, Samuel requested as they rode on. Miguel shrugged. Most went to smaller spreads. A few to Prescott's Bar None. Better pay, less trouble. Samuel's interest sharpened. They went to work for the very outfit causing the problems? Miguel's dark eyes were knowing. Some men, they follow the money. And Prescott, he pays well for men who know the Circle W's operations. By mid-afternoon, Samuel had seen enough to understand the full scope of the problem. The ranch was being systematically stripped of resources, cattle rustled, fences cut, water sources tampered with. Small, constant pressures designed to bleed the operation dry rather than take it in one confrontation that might attract outside attention. Back at the main house, he found Elizabeth and Catherine poring over ledgers in the study. "It's worse than you indicated," he stated without preamble. "You've lost at least a third of your herd in the past 6 months." Catherine's mouth tightened, 38% to be precise. Elizabeth looked up, her expression determined despite the worry in her eyes. "Can it be salvaged?" Samuel removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "Yes, but not by playing defense. We need to change tactics." Over the next 3 weeks, Samuel transformed the Circle W's operations. He reorganized the remaining hands into rotating patrol shifts, focusing on strategic points rather than trying to cover the entire property. He hired 4 new men, carefully vetted through Miguel's connections, rather than the usual channels that Prescott might monitor. He established new cattle movement patterns, unpredictable and designed to concentrate the herd in more defensible areas. But most importantly, he began gathering information. The rustling continued, but at a reduced rate as the new security measures took effect. Samuel personally tracked one group back to Bar None property, confirming what they had all suspected but couldn't prove. Without local law support, however, such knowledge was of limited use. What they needed was leverage, or evidence too public to ignore. "You look troubled," Elizabeth observed one evening as they reviewed the day's operations on the porch. Samuel had been staring at the distant hills, his expression dark. "Prescott's getting impatient," he replied. "The easy pickings have stopped, and now he'll need to decide whether to back off or escalate." Elizabeth's hand stilled on the ledger she'd been updating. "And which do you think he'll choose?" Samuel met her gaze directly. "Men like Prescott don't back off. They can't afford to lose face." The unspoken danger hung between them. Elizabeth had proven herself a capable ranch manager over the past weeks, working alongside her sisters and the hands without complaint or special treatment. Samuel had developed a grudging respect for all 3 women, particularly Elizabeth, whose determination was matched by a practical intelligence he hadn't initially expected. "There's something else," Samuel continued after a moment. "I've been asking around town. Prescott's in debt to the Territorial Bank in Phoenix. He's expanded too quickly, borrowing against future profits. If the beef market shifts, or if his operation hits unexpected trouble," Elizabeth caught his meaning immediately. "He's not just being greedy. He needs our land and cattle to meet his obligations." Samuel nodded, "And that makes him desperate. Desperate men are dangerous." Elizabeth's green eyes hardened with resolve. "So are desperate women, Mr. Hayes. I assume you have a plan." Samuel couldn't help the slight smile that touched his lips. "I always have a plan, Miss Wilson, but you might not like it." Elizabeth squared her shoulders. "Try me. I've long since abandoned any illusions about fair play when it comes to survival out here." The following night, Samuel rode out alone, dressed entirely in black, with his face darkened by soot. His destination was a small line cabin on Bar None property, where, according to Miguel's information, 2 of Prescott's men often spent the night when working the shared boundary. These weren't just any hands, but the ones Miguel had identified as former Circle W workers who had crossed over to Prescott's employ after Miller's death. If anyone knew the truth about what happened to the former foreman, it would be them. The cabin was isolated, a good mile from the main Bar None operations, perfect for Samuel's purposes. He approached on foot after securing his horse in a stand of cottonwoods, moving silently through the darkness with skills honed during years of tracking fugitives across the territories. Light spilled from the cabin's single window, along with the sounds of conversation and laughter. Samuel circled the structure once, confirming that only 2 men were inside before making his move. He kicked the door open with explosive force, his peacemaker already drawn and leveled. "Evening, gentlemen," he said coldly, as the 2 men froze in shock, cards and whiskey forgotten. "He remember me?" The older of the 2, Bill Harker, who had worked 4 years at the Circle W, recovered first. "Hayes, heard you'd taken up with the Wilson girls. Bold move, considering what happened to Miller." The younger man, Jed Tompkins, was visibly nervous, his hand inching toward the revolver at his hip until Samuel's warning shot splintered the wood beside his fingers. "I wouldn't," Samuel advised quietly. "Now both of you, hands on the table. We're going to have a friendly chat about Frank Miller." 2 hours later, Samuel rode back toward the Circle W with the information he needed. It hadn't been pleasant work, but Harker and Tompkins were alive and likely to remain that way if they followed his instructions. More importantly, he now knew the truth about Miller's death and had a plan to use that knowledge. The ranch was quiet when he returned, most hands already asleep, except for the night patrol. Samuel slipped into his cabin without being observed, washed the soot from his face, and changed clothes before heading to the main house, where a light still burned in the study. As he'd expected, Elizabeth was awake and working despite the late hour. She looked up sharply at his knock, relief washing over her features when she recognized him. "You were successful?" she asked without preamble. "Yes," Samuel confirmed, closing the study door behind him. "Miller was killed by Harker and Tompkins on Prescott's direct orders. They were paid $100 each for the job." Elizabeth's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "Can they testify to that?" Samuel shook his head. "Not without implicating themselves, but they've agreed to sign statements that they witnessed Caldwell, Prescott's foreman, pull the trigger. In exchange for safe passage out of the territory." Elizabeth's brow furrowed. "Will that be enough? The sheriff?" Samuel cut her off gently. "We're not going to the sheriff. We're going over his head to the territorial marshal. With signed statements and evidence of the rustling operations, it should be enough to bring an investigation that even Prescott's influence can't stop." Elizabeth studied his face in the lamplight. "There's something you're not telling me." Samuel hesitated, then admitted, "I knew Theodore Wilson. Not well, but we crossed paths several times when I was still wearing a badge. He was a good man who helped me track down a gang operating along the border 5 years ago." Understanding dawned in Elizabeth's eyes. "That's why you took this job. Not just for a fresh start, but because you felt you owed him." Samuel didn't deny it. "Your father saved my life during that operation. I couldn't ignore his daughter's request for help, even if I didn't know that's what it was when I accepted the position." Elizabeth was silent for a long moment. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Hayes, but it doesn't change our current situation." "No, it doesn't," Samuel agreed. "But it might change how we approach Prescott. Men like him understand power and leverage. Right now, we have evidence that could send him to territorial prison. That's leverage." Elizabeth leaned forward, intrigued. "You're suggesting we confront him directly? Offer him a deal?" Samuel nodded. "A negotiated settlement. He backs off completely, signs an agreement acknowledging the Circle W boundaries. And we don't pursue charges for Miller's murder or the rustling." Elizabeth considered this, her practical mind assessing the strategy. He'd never agree unless he believed we could actually harm him. And he controls the sheriff. Any evidence we have might mysteriously disappear before reaching the territorial authorities. Samuel smiled grimly. That's why I've already sent copies of the statements to 3 different places, including to a former colleague at the U.S. Marshal's office in Tucson. The next morning, Samuel rode into town alone, stopping first at the telegraph office to send a carefully worded message to his former deputy marshal, now stationed in Phoenix. The evidence would be secure regardless of what happened next. His second stop was the Prescott Bank and Mercantile, Richard Prescott's center of operations when not at his ranch. The imposing brick building stood in stark contrast to the mostly wooden structures along the main street, a testament to Prescott's wealth and influence in the region. Samuel entered with deliberate confidence, ignoring the curious stares of the bank tellers and customers. "I need to see Mr. Prescott," he informed the manager, a nervous man named Hobson, who clearly recognized him. "It's urgent Reg business." Hobson hesitated, then nodded toward a door marked private at the rear of the bank. "He's with Mr. Caldwell, but I'll inform him you're here." Samuel waited patiently, aware of the whispers his presence had generated. His reputation had preceded him to this town as well, it seemed. After several minutes, Hobson emerged and gestured for Samuel to enter. Richard Prescott sat behind an ornate desk, a contrast to Jackson Caldwell, who stood beside him, hand resting ostentatiously on his gun belt. Prescott was in his 50s, expensively dressed, with the smooth hands and substantial girth of a man who directed rather than performed labor. His smile was practiced, but failed to reach his cold eyes. "Mr. Hayes, I've heard much about your colorful past. What brings the Circle W's new foreman to my establishment?" "A business proposition," Samuel replied calmly, remaining standing despite Prescott's gesture toward a chair. "One that benefits us both if you're smart enough to take it." Caldwell bristled at the implied insult, but Prescott raised a hand to silence him. "I'm always interested in mutually beneficial arrangements. Please, continue." Samuel removed an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the desk. Inside are copies of signed statements from Bill Harker and Jed Tompkins, detailing how they witnessed Jackson Caldwell murder Frank Miller on your orders. The color drained from Prescott's face, while Caldwell's hand tightened on his gun. "That's a damned lie," the foreman snarled. Samuel ignored him, keeping his focus on Prescott. "The originals, along with evidence of your rustling operations, are already on their way to the Territorial Marshal's office." Prescott recovered quickly, his businessman's mind calculating options. "Interesting fiction, Mr. Hayes, but hardly proof of anything. 2 disgruntled employees making wild accusations won't stand up in any court." Samuel's expression remained impassive. "Perhaps, but combined with the evidence of systematic cattle theft, unusual expansion of your herd, and your significant bank loans that require explanation." He let the implications hang in the air. "The territorial governor takes a dim view of murder and theft, Mr. Prescott, particularly when it threatens the stability and reputation of growing communities." Prescott's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You seem very confident for a man whose own reputation is questionable at best. The incident in Tucson raised serious concerns about your judgment." "The incident in Tucson demonstrated that I don't hesitate when necessary," Samuel countered smoothly. "But we're not here to discuss my past. We're here to resolve the present situation." He removed a second document from his jacket. "This is an agreement drawn up by Catherine Wilson. It stipulates that you acknowledge the Circle W boundaries, cease all harassment, and return any stolen cattle still in your possession. In exchange, The Wilson sisters will not pursue charges related to Miller's death or the rustling operations. Prescott stared at the document, calculation evident in his eyes. And if I refuse? Samuel smiled thinly. Then I'd telegraph Phoenix this afternoon, and you can explain to the territorial marshal why 2 of your men are willing to testify against you. Caldwell moved suddenly, drawing his revolver with practiced speed. But not fast enough. Samuel's peacemaker cleared its holster in a blur of motion, the barrel pressing against Caldwell's temple before his own weapon was fully raised. That would be unwise, Samuel said quietly, especially with witnesses in the next room. Prescott's face had gone pale again, his eyes fixed on the tableau before him. "Stand down, Jackson," he ordered sharply. "Mr. Hayes and I are having a civilized discussion." Slowly, reluctantly, Caldwell lowered his weapon. Samuel kept his Colt trained on the foreman as he backed toward the door. "You have until sundown to decide, Prescott. The agreement or the telegram. I'm a reasonable man, but the Wilson sisters have lost patience. They want justice for Frank Miller, one way or another." Back at the Circle W, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Margaret waited anxiously for Samuel's return. When he finally rode through the gate in mid-afternoon, all 3 sisters emerged onto the porch. "Well?" Elizabeth asked as he dismounted. Samuel handed her the agreement, Prescott's signature clearly visible at the bottom. He saw reason, or at least he saw that fighting would cost more than conceding. Catherine took the document, examining it with a critical eye. He signed without amendments? No conditions? Samuel shook his head. "None, though I don't think we've made a friend for life." This drew a rare smile from the serious middle sister. "Friendship wasn't our goal, Mr. Hayes. Survival was." Margaret, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "What about Frank's murderer? Caldwell just goes free?" Samuel's expression softened slightly as he regarded the youngest Wilson. "Justice comes in many forms, Miss Margaret. Caldwell's reputation will be ruined once word spreads about his role in Miller's death, as it inevitably will. No reputable ranch will hire him. And Prescott, now under scrutiny, can't afford to keep him on." Elizabeth nodded in understanding. "He'll be driven from the territory, just as he drove others away through fear." Samuel didn't mention the final warning he'd delivered privately to Caldwell before leaving town. A promise that if the foreman ever troubled the Circle W or the Wilson sisters again, no territorial border would be distant enough to ensure his safety. Some threats were more effective when not shared with employers, even ones as understanding as Elizabeth Wilson. Over the following weeks, the agreement with Prescott held. Stolen cattle were returned, fences remained uncut, and the atmosphere of siege around the Circle W gradually lifted. With Samuel's guidance, the ranch began to recover. New hands were hired, cattle drives were successfully completed to the railhead, and for the first time in months, the ledgers showed profits rather than losses. Samuel settled into his role as foreman and partner, finding unexpected satisfaction in building something rather than merely enforcing the law. The Wilson sisters proved to be capable partners, Elizabeth with her knowledge of cattle and operations, Catherine with her financial acumen, and Margaret with her gift for horses that had already improved their stock considerably. One evening in late autumn, as the first chill settled over the land, Samuel sat on the porch of his cabin, cleaning his peacemaker, a habit he maintained despite the reduced need to wear it daily. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up to find all 3 Wilson sisters walking toward him. Elizabeth carried a bottle of good whiskey, Catherine held documents, and Margaret brought a plate of Maria's freshly baked cornbread. "We come bearing gifts and business," Elizabeth announced with one of her rare smiles. "May we join you?" Samuel set aside his work and nodded toward the porch chairs. "Always welcome, ladies, though I'm curious about the occasion." Catherine handed him the papers first, the quarterly figures. "As agreed, your 15% share of the profits." Samuel examined the documents, eyebrows rising at the amount. "More than expected," he acknowledged, genuinely impressed by the turnaround. Elizabeth poured 4 small glasses of whiskey. "A testament to your management and our partnership. The Circle W is healthier than it's been since Father passed." She raised her glass. "To successful ventures and new beginnings." They drank, the whiskey burning pleasantly as it went down. Margaret, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "We have another proposition, Mr. Hayes." Samuel looked at her curiously. "I'm listening." The youngest Wilson sister glanced at her siblings for confirmation before continuing. "We'd like to rename the ranch from Circle W to Circle WH. Wilson and Hayes." Samuel stared at her in surprise, then looked to Elizabeth and Catherine for clarification. Catherine's expression was its usual practical self. "It makes financial sense. You've become more than a foreman. You're a full partner now. The name should reflect that reality." Elizabeth's gaze was warmer, holding something Samuel hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in their months of working together. "And it signals to everyone in the territory that the Circle WH stands united, no longer perceived as vulnerable." Samuel took another sip of whiskey, considering their offer. It was more than a business arrangement. It was acceptance, belonging, a permanent place after years of wandering since turning in his badge. "I'm honored," he said finally, "and I accept." As the evening deepened around them, talk turned to future plans. Expanding the herd, breeding better stock, perhaps adding sheep on the high pasture land that wasn't ideal for cattle. Samuel found himself drawn into the discussion, offering suggestions and building on the sisters' ideas. For the first time since Tucson, he felt settled, his past neither forgotten nor defining him completely. The Circle WH would never be an easy operation. The Arizona territory demanded constant vigilance and hard work, but it was theirs, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. Later, as Elizabeth lingered after her sisters had returned to the main house, she stood beside him at the porch railing, looking out at the land that stretched before them in the moonlight. "Don't be afraid," she said softly, echoing words she had spoken months earlier when he'd first agreed to the partnership. "We share everything now." Samuel turned to face her, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. The distance between them had narrowed gradually over the months, professionalism, giving way to friendship and then to something more that neither had acknowledged until now. "I'm not afraid, Elizabeth," he replied, his weathered hand covering hers on the railing. "Not anymore." The ranch spread out before them, silver under the moon. Their ranch, their future. In this harsh territory, where second chances were rare, Samuel Hayes had found not only redemption, but a home, surrounded by 3 remarkable women who had proved as resilient as the land itself. As Elizabeth's fingers interlaced with his, Samuel knew with certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, partners in every sense of the word. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.